Kris cannot be Chara. I'm not 100% saying that they're Frisk, a combination of the two, one of the other souls, or that they're an entirely separate entity, as it's just too soon to say. But I can categorically say that they 100% aren't Chara alone. It is not too soon to say that. Them being Chara goes against the established rules of the Undertale and Deltarune universes. Before we get into my reasoning, I'd like to thank the people in the comments of this Reddit thread and this Tumblr post. I've both linked in the description as they helped a lot. It is biologically impossible for Kris to be the Deltarune universe's Chara. Every single character in both games is biologically the same person. Every single one. If you took Undertale Bratty and Deltarune Bratty's DNA tests, it would have the same results. Kris has a different hair color to Chara. They have a different skin color, which could mean they are different races for all we know. I've heard some people say this is a tanning thing, which is definitely not true. I have also heard some people say this is because Chara is a corpse, which I also don't think is true. Although it would be funny if Toby let the Undertale yellow developers make a game with a corpse protagonist without knowing. Assuming Chara isn't squinting sideways, their eyes are open. This means they have a different eye color to Kris. I admit Demon Chara being associated with red eyes is definitely acknowledged by Toby. Kris having red eyes is clearly for the genocide fake out at the end of chapter 1. However, regular human Chara would not have red eyes. So Kris having red eyes shouldn't actually link them to human form Chara. One physical characteristic is not enough to equate them when everything else is contradictory. Even if Chara's eyes were canonically always red, unless they have different parentage, it is literally impossible for Chara to be a different race in Deltarune, and at that point they aren't the same life form. People only make behavioral arguments for Chara when biology comes first in importance. If there was an AU where Papyrus acted like Sans, and Sans acted like Papyrus, that does not make this Sans AU Papyrus, and that does not make this Papyrus AU Sans. Sans is still this AU's Sans, and Papyrus is still this AU's Papyrus. People say Kris is in the same family position as Chara. This is not true. From what we learn in Undertale, Chara and Asriel seem to be treated as equals and were roughly the same age. There was no age dynamic between them. If anything, Asriel looked up at Chara and viewed them as the authority figure in the friendship and would follow their ideas. However, in Deltarune there is a clear age dynamic present. Kris is the younger sibling and is treated as such, just like Noelle is to Des. They clearly look up to Asriel, which Chara definitely does not. This creates a clear role difference in my mind. If Deltarune Asriel knew a Chara, I'd imagine they'd be closer to his age, which I guess is why so many people have the college roommates theory, which I kinda like personally. Not to mention the fact that the way Asgore and Toriel talk about Chara is very different to Kris in Deltarune. Deltarune Kris is their child through and through, no doubt. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure they took in Chara as if they were their child, but there's a huge difference between an adopted child you've had for presumably their whole life, and a kid who lived with you for a bit before they caused the death of your biological son. I'm sure they viewed Chara as their kid after adopting them, but it's just inherently a different thing. Toriel and Asgore talk about Chara as a person they knew long ago, rather than their actual child as they talk of Asriel. They definitely loved Chara, but they probably have more mixed emotions on it than they do Kris, who truly is their child on an equal level to Asriel. Kris wears a yellow and green shirt or sweater. I am more inclined to say this is a Dreamer thing than an Chara thing, as Asriel also wears that color scheme in Undertale. In the flashback we see the stripe in the middle of Chara's shirt is darker, meaning it cannot be a green shirt with yellow stripes. Asriel's also isn't, to be fair, but I think it's assumed that Toriel started making these yellow and green jumpers for both of them after they met. Toriel just likes to dress her kids this way. Also, the shade of the jumper we see in Deltarune is much more like Asriel's in Undertale than Chara's. I've heard some people counter this by saying that Toriel doesn't dress up Frisk this way when they adopt them at the end of Undertale, true pacifist. But I think that's for pretty obvious reasons. This shirt clearly has tragedy associated with it for Toriel at this point in the Undertale timeline. Why would Toriel want to dress Frisk up like her two dead kids? The yellow and green is a Dreamer thing, not a Chara thing. I've heard some people say that Chara covers their eyes like Kris, but I think that's untrue. Chara's eyes are covered from a storytelling perspective, so we think they're Frisk in the opening cutscene. Their sprite, which we can assume is a more accurate version of them, does not cover their eyes. There's a difference between when a piece of media doesn't show us the face of a character, and when the character in a piece of media is purposely hiding their face. Aside from this one image with the flower, Chara makes no effort to cover their eyes, and we only don't see them due to camera placement. People think Kris being a prankster is comparable to Chara, and I genuinely think that's insane. Chara isn't a prankster, they're a schemer. Nothing they do in Undertale could really be considered a prank. The main notable quote-unquote pranks they do are poisoning Asgore and attempting to genocide humanity. If you think this is comparable to Kris spam calling Birdly on Noelle's website, I don't know what to say. Kris's pranks are much more in line with the cheeky tendencies of another character we'll discuss later in the video. Chara actively despises humanity, whereas we get the impression Kris doesn't hate them, but is more comfortable being around monsters and would rather live with them. This is also like that character we'll discuss later in the video. One of Chara's main characteristics is their emotional abuse and gaslighting of Azrael. I don't think this is something that has ever happened with Kris. The dynamic just isn't like that. The closest we see to any antisocial behavior like that is in Snowgrave, and I think it's fair to say that Kris had no control over that. Chara letting Toriel hold their hand and walk them out seems out of character. They're too independent. They don't seem like a mommy's them. Kris doesn't defend themselves from Susie's bullying at all in the Spamton sweepstakes story or the start of chapter 1. Keep in mind that Chara living a bad life with humans caused them to attempt to wipe out the entire species, yet Kris seems to kind of enjoy being bullied by Susie. Chara would retaliate, or at least plan to, whereas Kris really likes Susie. Chara likes chocolate like Kris, but enjoying sweet food seems to be a unifying thing among the KFC. They all love sweet stuff. Frisk doesn't like soda, but that's just a typical sensitive kid thing. They still love sweets and stuff. I really struggle to consider it a personality trait, it's just not weird enough. If we met a skeleton of suspicious origin in Deltarune, who started downing ketchup, I'd be pretty suspicious, but a kid liking chocolate, it's just not unique enough a trait, and we are basing it off one line of dialogue. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely intentional. I should probably state at this point in the video that, yes, I know every parallel between Kris, Frisk, and Chara is intentional. I am just trying to focus on the ones that matter. You can draw character similarities and thematic parallels from them until the end of time. No matter what Toby Fox confirms or doesn't confirm, these characters are all designed to parallel each other. I am just trying to prove that Chara cannot biologically literally be Kris, which I do genuinely 100% believe in. The best connection between Kris and Chara is probably the knives thing. Whilst Frisk can use knives in Undertale, Chara definitely owns the Undertale knives stock market. I could say I think it's weird that Toriel is okay with Kris having a knife without context, so maybe the Dreamers are just one of those families that train their kids with pocket knives and stuff. But this is obviously a huge stretch. I admit it, Chara owns knives. Does this mean I think Kris is Chara? No, not even for a second. The fact Kris owns a knife doesn't make me think Kris is Chara at all. Them having a knife could never outweigh the fact that it's literally biologically impossible for them to be Chara. Like I said guys, I know there are a heap of parallels between Chara and Kris, but there is so much more evidence for literally every other candidate, and so much evidence against Chars that I genuinely think it's impossible. The knife thing is only in the game to make the end if chapter 1 red herring. I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if we never see it after chapter 2. And if we're going to use this as key evidence, there are way more Frisk items in Deltarune than Chara items, so let's not go there. The segment solely criticizing Chara theory is over, and I will now discuss all the candidates that I think are possible. But don't you worry, there is still plenty of Chara theory complaining coming. It's just that some of it was hard to talk about, without the context of one of the upcoming candidates. I'm going to go through them in order of how much I have to say about them, from least to most. I am going to include the theory of Kris being a fusion of Frisk and Chara in this, as in my opinion that makes them a different person entirely. Kris being this or an entirely separate entity is definitely possible. This seems to be the most popular idea in the fandom, and I understand why. The only thing that could be seen as evidence against this is their physical similarity to Frisk, and their name being almost an anagram. But that's not really evidence against this, it's just evidence another candidate has. This is entirely possible and I don't feel strongly against it. There is some evidence that Kris is another soul, particularly the Cyan Soul. The toy knife is the Cyan Soul's weapon, the white ribbon is Kris's first armor, and the faded ribbon is the Cyan Soul's. Kris's Dark World form heavily features cyan. Also, people argue that Kris has a lot of patience-related traits, for example playing piano. This is possible also, more so than Chara, but there isn't enough evidence for me to be sold. It's more speculation at this point. Aside from Asriel, who kind of confuses things, the parallel timeline of Deltarune adds up a lot more if Frisk is Undertale's Kris. All of the monsters here were the ones alive for Frisk, and Jerson dying in Undertale when Frisk reaches Kris's age is very likely. Why would Toby select all of the characters Frisk interacted with if this is supposed to be an AU for Chara? Chara knew like 3 of these guys. Kris is clearly designed to look like an aged-up Frisk. Same hair but grown with age. Their skin tone, possibly race, is the same. They have the blank facial expression. They look identical, even if they had more notable differences they are still clearly an aged-up Frisk. This makes Kris being Frisk biologically possible unlike Chara. Literally every single character in Deltarune looks like their Undertale counterpart, so it's fair to assume Kris is Frisk. Again, I need to repeat. Every single one. Monster Kid is around the same size as Frisk in Undertale. Them and Kris being the same age in Deltarune could be because Kris is an aged-up Frisk. In Undertale, the Clam Girl says that Frisk would be friends with Susie, and in Deltarune Kris becomes friends with Susie. This is the only possible way to make this foreshadowing make sense for me, as I highly doubt the Clam Girl is aware of the player or whatever meta angle you'd like to take with it. Not to mention that Frisk often wants to befriend people who treat them badly, unlike Chara. Chara would not be friends with Susie, guys. Clam Girl also says Frisk is Susie's age, further enforcing Kris being an aged-up Frisk. Kris and Frisk are both younger than Asriel, unlike Chara who seem to be around the same age as Asriel. Further reasoning to believe the college roommates theory, I guess. Kris and Frisk are both certified Rizzlers. I'm not gonna say Chara doesn't have any Riz, but Kris and Frisk are just next level. Kris's pranks line up a lot more with Frisk's cheekier moments and dialogue options. What sounds more like a Kris prank? Telling Undyne that anime is literally real life, or poisoning your adopted father? What sounds more like a Kris prank? Flattening a cinnamon bun and shoving it under a hotel door, or trying to exterminate humanity? What sounds more like a Kris prank? Emptying the entire water machine for no reason, or emotionally abusing and manipulating Asriel? I'm not even one of those people who think Chara is pure evil or anything, but Kris is just much more aligned with Frisk's cheekiness than Chara's scheming. Sorry, but there is a huge difference between comic mischief and the stuff Chara gets up to. Kris and Frisk are similar names and are basically anagrams. If you repeat the names out loud enough times, it literally just sounds the same. The spelling difference is acceptable as we have 3 examples of characters who possibly have different spellings in the Undertale and Deltarune universes: Susie, Heats Flamesman, and possibly Frisk. Keep in mind that Toby picked Frisk as the main character's name in Undertale because he needed to choose a very uncommon name that nobody was likely to pick. He probably always wanted this character to be called Kris. Kris being dragged along by Toriel holding their hand is certified Frisk behavior. Chara would not let that slide. Kris's colors in the Dark World are a more vibrant version of Frisk's colors in Undertale, which I feel can be attributed to Kris more than the green and yellow. The Dark World versions of characters seem to reflect what the characters think is cool, so I think Kris's color scheme here says more about themselves than whatever Toriel makes them wear. People always bring up Chara's liking of chocolate, but Kris is probably more in love with pies than chocolate. This is more associated with Frisk than Chara, as Frisk is known for a partial gobble of pie in Undertale. Kris is still a chocolate fanatic, don't get me wrong, but pie is clearly the favorite. I mean, they ripped out the red soul for it. Every Chara parallel seems to have a more significant Frisk parallel, and then like 5 more Frisk things on the side. There's just more Frisk evidence, sorry. If we are going to treat it like Kris having a knife is this big thing, Kris and Frisk both have a bandage and wooden object. Kris and Frisk are both fire piano players. This is a stretch, but it could maybe be argued that Frisk in Undertale at the end of True Pacifist is kind of closer to the Deltarune Dreamer dynamic than Chara was. If Asriel was alive in goat form, Frisk would be the younger sibling of the dynamic just like Kris. Asgore and Toriel would still be broken up. Not to mention Kris being the younger sibling of the dynamic again, which is just not true for Chara at all. When Asriel talks about Chara and says that Frisk is the friend he wished he had, that reality Asriel is thinking about is basically what Kris and Asriel have in Deltarune. Also, if we control Frisk in Undertale, it kind of just makes more sense that we'll control Frisk in Deltarune rather than Chara. Unlike Gaster, who will probably get more story involved, I get the impression Toby wants to leave a lot of Chara's past mysterious. I'm kind of praying for Asriel college roommate theory though. Somebody mentioned to me on Reddit that Deltarune Chara might just be rotting at the bottom of Mount Ebott in the Deltarune universe, and that's way too bleak. I don't want to believe in that. Any Chara parallel to Kris can be explained by them being the Deltarune universe's Frisk. Don't forget, Frisk and Chara are literally designed from the ground up to be parallel characters of each other. So yeah, if Kris is Frisk, they'll still parallel Chara heavily. I am open to any idea of who Kris is except for Chara. I'm sorry gamers, but it's literally biologically impossible. Kris is clearly designed to make the players think they are Frisk. This leads me to believe they are either Deltarune's Frisk, or the subversion is that they are an entirely separate entity. It honestly probably doesn't even matter to this game's story. I will probably just assume Frisk until proven otherwise personally. It honestly probably doesn't even matter to this game's story. I will just assume Frisk until proven otherwise personally. They 100% objectively speaking cannot be Chara without breaking the story's own established rules. Them being Chara would just be bad writing and art design. A subversion done for no reason at all. And like I said, I don't think Toby Fox is super interested in expanding Chara as a character and wants to leave things up to mystery. Whereas Kris still has their story to tell, and if they are Frisk they've already been fleshed out way more than they were in Undertale, which is cool. Personally, regardless of whether they are Frisk or not, I think Kris fills Frisk's role in Deltarune. Chara definitely is not the vessel, but the vessel fills Chara's role being the character who you think you're going to play as, the character you name, and who probably comes back later in the story. If Chara is involved in Deltarune at all, I am honestly pretty confident that it will be through them being friends with Asriel or something. I don't see any other way they could get involved. I could see Asriel mentioning their human friend at college or something. I doubt we will actually see them in the game though. As I said, I think Toby wants to leave Chara mysterious. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Chara Kris theory has bothered me for ages lol. I genuinely think it's worse than people saying Sans remembers resets. One thing I forgot to mention but was too late to add in is that Kris's eyes are basically impossible to determine and are therefore hard to discuss. They appear white here, but red here. Kris's eyes are red in the dark world, but Berdley's eyes change when in the dark world, so we can't use that definitively. Either way though, it disproves Chara equals Kris theory, as Chara in human form does not have red or white eyes. It's literally impossible. May I say for the final time, every single Deltarune to Undertale character biologically matched their counterpart. Every single one. If you liked this video, please leave a like and a comment or something. If it bothered you immensely, feel free to leave a death threat and report the video.